Wednesday. Super excited to catch up with Chris Biderman from the Sacramento Bee, who's absolutely killing it. Covering the Sacramento Kings. Chris, no, you really are. I mean, obviously, I know you've been in the game for a long time. You did a lot of stuff on the Niners. Now you're focused in on the Kings. I feel like it's hard to be, and maybe it's not. Maybe I'm overrating your talent. I don't know. You crushed it with the Niners, and you're crushing it with the Kings. I feel like you're just a really good storyteller, one, but you ask really good questions, and it feels like you've been around Sacramento covering the Kings for years. You fit in like it's been perfect.
Well, I appreciate that. I don't love like talking about myself in those terms, but I will say like I got to be around a lot of really great people and really great journalists covering the 49ers, as you guys know. Matt Barrows, Matt Mayoko, Eric Branch, Nick Wagner. And, so I've been lucky in that coming up in the business and covering pro sports, I've been surrounded by a lot of really great, talented people. And I've sort of learned to ask questions from them. And I appreciate you saying that because I think a lot about the questions that I try to ask. And I think it's one of the most important parts of the job. So I appreciate you guys saying that.
Yeah, I think you just they're very thoughtful, and you could tell you do take time.
You always get something out of it.
Yeah, I think there are too many times, that I mean, we were around enough press conference. You're like, okay, that was a really lame question.
Sure.
Are you just asking a question to ask a question? And Chris, I feel like you have a purpose for it. So I don't know. I've just really enjoyed your work. Talking about last night's Kings game. Did you feel like that was more of like a scheduled loss? I know the Celtics are legit, and I feel like even if the Kings were rested, it was going to be a tough game. But how much do you think that impacted things, the fifth game in 7 nights?
Yeah, I think it did for sure. But also, like, these things happen in the NBA to every team. And it's not the Celtics are playing their third game in 4 nights, and they're at the end of a long 6-game road trip. So while it was a back-to-back and the Kings did have to come back from Utah, they weren't the only team on the floor last night dealing with difficult circumstances. The Celtics were, basically playing on their home stadium, or their home city is at 10 p.m. Like they've been on the road for a little bit. So their body clock might have been a little bit more adjusted at this point, but still a 6-game road trip for a team from the East coming out West is difficult. And yeah, like you're losing, you don't have Kevin Huerter. You have played a bunch of games. I have a feeling that the Kings players may or may not have been out in DC Saturday night. So before, and then returning to the practice floor in Georgetown on Sunday, and then flying to Utah and playing that game. So yeah, sure. Like you could say it was tired legs and a lot of that, but I think you could have made a similar case for the Celtics overall. And, from my standpoint, like to just write the game off as a schedule loss, I think glosses over a lot of the issues that the Kings had, right? Like a lot of it, maybe you're tired mentally and maybe you're not going to play with as much intensity offensively, but that doesn't mean you can't just try to move the ball more. It doesn't mean that you can't try to cut backdoor more often. Like Mike Brown was talking about all these things that the Kings could have done to combat the Celtics switching defense. And frankly, it was just, I think when it comes playoff time, that's the type of defense the Kings are going to have to be ready to go against. They're going to be going against teams that are going to be more locked in defensively, with more talent on the defensive end, with a lot of length. And we know, particularly in De'Aaron Fox and Domantas Sabonis's case, that like length can bother those guys. So I think it was, it's the Kings are 0-6 against the top 3 teams in the East.
Yeah.
And, the Philadelphia came in and beat the Kings in Golden One Center earlier this season without Joel Embiid and James Harden. And one of the things they talked about was just the physicality that those teams have, and the Milwaukee Bucks last week. Like the physicality that those teams have is sort of something that those teams have gotten more comfortable with and adopted because of their experience that they've had in the playoffs. And Malik Monk basically said it last night that, they've been there. They know the requisite physicality that it takes to play that type of basketball. And the Kings so far have been a great regular season story. And I'm not trying to take anything away from them, but it's going to be a different level when they get to the playoffs. And they don't want to be a team that just breaks a 16-year playoff drought. They want to do more than that. They want to build something sustainable, and they want to be a contender for years to come. So they're going to have to increase their physicality and be able to combat when other teams are physical against them. So I think it's been a pretty notable litmus test for them playing against the Bucks and playing against a team like the Celtics. And that, yeah, you could say it was a schedule loss, but like these are still opportunities for you to measure yourself against teams that are really top tier NBA championship contenders. And ultimately, if you want to get there, you need to play a certain way. And I think the Bucks and Celtics proved a little bit to them that you have to play a different way than you have been playing in the regular season if you're going to take that next step and become a true championship contender.
Yeah, and I think too, when you look at teams like the Celtics and the Bucks in these last couple of weeks, they played up. You know, they came in wanting to make sure they were playing their best basketball against the Sacramento Kings. You saw the way that the Celtics played last night after their loss against the Jazz the other night. And we hear this story on The Athletic today that, oh, Al Horford brought his team together, rallied everyone together and was like, what do you guys want? What is your goal? Because if this is your goal, then this is how we're going to play. And of course, they did that right before the Sacramento Kings game, and they looked really good. And I think you're exactly right. It's a whole different game in the postseason. But I think one of my favorite things that I've seen from this King squad this season is that every time that they play a good team, it seems like they learn something new. Like they've made these in-season adjustments. Do you think the Kings in this amount of time headed into the postseason can learn from this Bucks team, from this Bucks game, from the Celtics game, and take on that experience going into the postseason?
Yeah, and I think absolutely. And I think that's one of the benefits you have with Mike Brown, right? Because Mike Brown being a defensive-minded coach coming in and being somebody who's coached on some championship winning teams, has an understanding of that level of physicality. And he talks about it with those guys. Like that's playing with a level of physicality without fouling is something he's constantly preaching to his team. And it might be a little bit tough because they frankly don't have personnel that typically lends itself to that style of play, right? Like you've seen some from Kessler Edwards. Obviously, Davion Mitchell can play that way. But you're trying to get guys to maybe play out of their comfort zone a little bit when you're talking about playing with that requisite level of physicality. And so that's really one of Mike Brown's biggest challenges. And again, I'm not trying to take away anything from the Kings or poo-poo on their season. It's been a remarkable turnaround, and I think they've far exceeded their expectations. But their season has been good enough now to where you recalibrate expectations and you say, okay, how do you measure yourself against the Celtics and the Bucks and the 76ers and those teams out east and the Nuggets and the Grizzlies? Like, how do you measure yourself against those teams? Because those are going to be the teams most likely that you're going to have to beat at some point along the road if you want to be a true championship contender. And that's like, and the Kings will tell you, like Mike Brown will tell you, the players will want to tell you, like De'Aaron Fox has said it a bunch of times, even when, you know, a couple weeks ago when they won their 40th game and you know, they clinched a 500 or better record last weekend in Brooklyn, when it was like, no, we don't. Yeah, that's great. But like no one before the season was excited about the idea of like, oh, we're going to be better than 500. De'Aaron Fox is like, no, my goal is to win a championship. And so there are still steps for them to take. And so I forget what your question is amid my ranting, but
no, it was just about like, can they make the in-season adjustments?
I think they can. I think Mike Brown knows what buttons to push, both tactically with his coaching staff. Jordy Fernandez is a really good assistant coach. And I think he knows sort of emotionally what the messaging is going to take, because he talks about this a lot too. Like the influence of Greg Popovich and Steve Kerr, those guys were just elite messengers in terms of how to relay the proper message to his team at the right time and the right message. And I think he's been really good at that. And it's why you haven't seen, you know, the Kings haven't lost 3 games in a row since the end of November, right? You have to go back to they played the Celtics and the Suns, oddly enough, which 2 teams they'll play this week. But so I think they do have that ability to bounce back, and they're a deep team, and they're a hungry team. And I would expect after a couple of days off that they'll be better come Friday and Saturday.
I thought Zach Lowe said something interesting this week, and I can't remember if it was on his podcast or the piece he wrote about the Kings, but he had mentioned that teams around the league respect the Kings, but they don't fear them,
Mm-hmm.
which is completely fair. And to that point, I think the good news with the Kings taking on the teams we're talking about, like the Bucks and the Celtics, who have been together for a long time. Their core guys have been there. They know each other. They know how to ramp up. They know how to play defense. These are championship caliber teams. These teams aren't going through the motions against Sacramento. And I just think, to what we were just talking about, it is so valuable for the Kings to be facing this late in the season,
Yes.
right before the playoffs start, because you're talking about teams in Boston and Milwaukee who are elite defensively, and Boston doing what they're doing, switching all the time. Not a lot of teams can execute that. Some of the teams in the West that the Kings may be taking on the playoffs won't be able to throw those types of looks at the Kings,
True.
but they're going to be throwing different looks. They're going to be trying to get Sabonis off of his game. They're going to try to throw different things at De'Aaron Fox. So I think it's beyond valuable for the Kings to face this. And I think this will make them better in the long run. It really will. And I'm with you on the expectations. Like, you adjust them, but I'm also realistic with this group. Like, we just talked about Boston. They didn't look like that
No.
year 2 with that group.
No.
Like,
Right.
Tatum, Horford, Brown, and Smart, they've been together for a long time. And I think the Kings have shown enough good signs with their core guys that they may be headed in the right direction, but it's going to take some time. And I am eager to see what it looks like down the stretch and in the playoffs when they face those different looks.
Yeah, and I asked Giannis Antetokounmpo last week when, after the Bucks beat them, like, what in your mind do the Kings need to do to take the next step? And he just says they need to go through it. They need to go through a playoff run. They need to win road games in a playoff series. They need to fall down in a playoff series and climb their way back up. They need to win a game 7. They need to lose a game 7. Like, these aren't like saying that the Kings are at a different level than these other teams that have been through those battles is not a knock on them. They just simply haven't done that. And in order to get to that level, you need to go through those things. Like the Warriors in 2013, they went to they beat the Denver Nuggets in the first round and lost to the San Antonio Spurs in the second round. And then they had the next year, they lost in the first round of the Clippers in 7 games, all before they ever won a championship or even got to the NBA Finals, right? Like, those were necessary steps. And if you were to ask Mike Brown or ask any of those Warriors players, they would tell you they had to go through those lumps and experience those playoff failures and successes before they could really take that next step and become actual contenders. And so that's where the Kings are at right now. So I don't think it's, I see Kings, some people who observe the Kings get like defensive over the idea that, like, they're not at the same level as Boston and Milwaukee. It's like, yeah, they're not. They haven't been through those battles
Right.
yet. But when they do get through those battles in 2 or 3 years from now, and if the core continues to progress and the team continue to take those steps, then they'll look back at this time and be like, yeah, I remember when Giannis came in and kicked our teeth in, and Boston came in and kicked our teeth in, and we learned the physicality that it took, and now we can apply that to these playoff runs that we're on right now. That's where I think the Kings are. And it's a good place to be. It's a fun place to be, particularly for a team that hasn't made the playoffs in 16 years. We're not talking about them, oh, couldn't they make the playoffs? Can they be better than the play? Like, no, they're like going to be a top 2, 3, 4 seed. And now we're talking about what they need to do to get to contention. And so I think that's the really cool thing about this season for them, is that they're beyond those expectations that we initially set in September and October. And they can look at these teams and say, okay, this is what we need to do if we ever want to get on that level, because it now feels like a realistic possibility that at some point down the line, the Kings can elevate themselves and be among that elite group in the NBA.
I think one thing I brought up to Morgan earlier this week that can really help the Kings throughout this too is the fact that this is not like a young coaching staff going through this for the first time either, right?
Right.
We talk so much about players and how they adjust to the playoffs. Coaches have that same deal, especially coaches that haven't done it before. Mike Brown and his staff is really experienced. Mike Brown was doing some crazy ass defensive adjustments in the playoffs last year for the Warriors during a championship run. And I do think that's one advantage that the Kings have with this group is, yes, the players haven't been through it, but this coaching staff has. And I think that can help Sacramento.
I think it's why, really, the biggest reason why Mike Brown has so much equity in the locker room, because he's not just flying by the seat of his pants, hoping that he can replicate some success that other coaches have had. He's been on those staffs and he's been around those elite players, championship winning players. Like, how many coaches can say that they coached Kobe Bryant, LeBron James, Steph Curry, Kevin Durant, Tim Duncan? Like Mike Brown is in a very elite list when it just comes to the people he's been around in the NBA. And I think all of that goes a long way with the players and why they respond to him and why they feel like they can have that level of accountability that he's been instituting since he got there. And they always talk about the culture, the accountability, and it starts with Mike because Mike knows what it looks like to be a championship level team, a championship level player, a championship level coaching staff. So that's why I think there is such a high level of buy-in with the Kings. It's a combination of Mike Brown and the equity he's built throughout his career in the NBA, but also the talent that fits in terms of the system that they're running offensively. They need to improve defensively, obviously, but just it all makes sense now, I think, for the first time in a long time when it comes to the Kings. And I think that's why, like with Mike Brown, that's why it was such a good hire for them, because he's been through those battles. He knows what it's like to coach all those elite players, and the guys see that and they buy into it.
Something that Deuce and I were talking a little bit about last night after the game was not seeing Kevin Huerter out there and how he was actually missed, like his presence was missed. And I'm going to read you this stat that Will Z put out there on Twitter about what Kevin Huerter's been doing. He said Huerter's 2-point field goal percentage by area, restricted area, 73.9%, non-restricted area, just in the paint, 56.3%. So you see so much more than just what he can do from beyond the arc, right? He can be effective inside the paint and move without the basketball, which allows defenses to obviously have to pay so much more attention to him. Do you think the Kings in these last couple of games have missed his presence out there? And do you think it's something else that's going to make them just get better and better as they continue on this path, putting him back into that starting lineup instead of someone as young as Kessler Edwards?
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the key reasons the Kings offense has been as successful as it has is they've typically had 4 good to elite shooters on the floor at all times. I would say Keegan Murray has been more or less an elite 3-point shooter. Kevin Huerter, at times when he's hot, has been an elite 3-point shooter. And then you have Harrison Barnes and De'Aaron Fox, who are respectable 3-point shooters, right? You saw at times last night, the Celtics just didn't really honor Kessler Edwards as a 3-point shooter, even though he made some early. And when you have to guard the 3-point line closely, when you're playing 4 guys out, that just creates so much more space. Whereas if one of those guys is playing on the perimeter and he's not a 3-point shooter that you have to honor consistently, well, that allows that defender to maybe sag off into the lane a little bit more, to maybe cheat towards the passing lanes, to maybe look at, play closer to the paint and be more conscious of cutters rather than forcing a closeout on an elite 3-point shooter. So when Kevin Huerter's been, I think he's been over 50% in March before he got hurt. Like, he's been really, really good from the 3-point line since the calendar turned from February to March. So the Kings having 4 shooters that you have to honor at the 3-point line has been huge for them all season. And it really allows them to unlock the most from De'Aaron Fox and Domantas Sabonis, because we know Sabonis is such a good passer and such a good screener. And when he can do those dribble handoffs with 4 guys instead of just 3, that makes a big difference, right? And when De'Aaron Fox is dribbling and trying to make plays, and he has 3 other shooters at his disposal, or guys are cutting off Domantas Sabonis screens, like that's really when the Kings offense is at its best. And Kevin Huerter is a big part of that. So when you lose his shooting, it allows the defense to maybe compact to the lane a little bit more, not have to worry about closing out at the 3-point line as much. And it's just an adjustment that the Kings are going to have to make. And they're hoping, obviously, that it's Kevin Huerter is going to be back soon, and that this is kind of a small sample size thing, and they can revert to what they've been when he gets back into the lineup.
Shout out to Chris, by the way, because he was on most of the last road trip, right?
Yeah.
And he covered the game last night. this is supposed to be kind of an off day, and he hung out with us for like 20 plus minutes talking about the Kings. So thank you so much for being with us, man.
I appreciate you guys. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, dude. And we'll see you. Are you going to be there Friday night?
I will not be there Friday or Saturday. I'm going to a wedding. It's not my wedding. It is but my girlfriend is going to be in the wedding, so it's an important wedding. So I would only miss Kings games for an important occasion like that. So
good for you. It's okay.
Well, I mean, Saturday could be the time they clinch the playoffs.
So you have to leave.
So you actually have to leave the wedding to get back. If that magic number is 1 going into Saturday, he has to actually leave the wedding.
Well, the good news is the wedding is Friday, but we're giving ourselves a grace period potentially before. But if it is really important that I come back,
no, it's not. You have a playoff run to cover. You're good.
Yeah,
enjoy this.
Be hungover. Do what you need to do.
Yeah, we'll make sure that the batteries are charged for the playoffs.
Well, enjoy it, man, and keep up the great work. We'll see you soon.
Thank you, guys. Appreciate it as always.
That's the one and only Chris Biderman. You could check out his work, sacb.com. He's doing a great job.
Like you said,
he's amazing.
Yeah.
And again,